In this eye-opening session, we've got Daphne, Koller and Priya Lakhani to discuss which trends are here to stay and what new shape higher education will take in the next 5 years. Priya, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I am so excited. This is the best session in the EdTech stage. So anyone in higher education, anyone in education, anyone interested in education, which I think is all of us, really, it's the entire planet, tune into this session and tell your friends about it. It will be available for all to see. I'm really excited about it. I'm Priya Lakhani. I'm the founder and chief executive of CenturyTech. So we've built an AI in education for teaching and learning that is used across 65 countries in K-12. But the reason why this is really, really exciting is we're going to step into higher education. And we're going to step into a conversation with someone who I think is, one of the world's leading experts in this space, who has disrupted the space of higher education. So we're really, really fortunate to hear from her. So I'd love to introduce to my stage today at CogX, Daphne Koller, who is the CEO and founder of insitro. She's co-founder of Coursera, and she's also a board member and of Engageli. And we were talking about Engageli only recently. Daphne, welcome to CogX.
Thank you, Priya. It's a pleasure to be here. Very exciting.
I'm so excited to speak to you. So Daphne, I think, we've got to talk about what is on everybody's mind, and that is the crisis. I don't think there's going to be one session where the pandemic is not going to be discussed. So the first question I really want to kick off with, if you don't mind, let's get stuck in and right to it, is what has the pandemic taught us about the way in which we deliver education, particularly with a focus on higher education?
So I think we've learned three things. The first thing that we learned is that we can, in fact, deliver a higher education in an online virtual format. We had to do that. There was no choice. And so people stepped in often with minimal preparation because they'd never really taught online, as most institutions, in fact, had not. And they learned that if needs be, they can actually do that. The second thing that we learned is that students, although there was a lot of, a certain level of dissatisfaction with the format and the way in which the content was offered, there was also a huge sigh of relief among many students because they were finally able to access the course content in a way that aligned with the needs of their daily life. And so that was an incredible access provider to such a large number of students. And the third thing that we learned, which I think is also really important, is that while students like the flexibility and the access that the virtual format provides, it's also a format where it's more challenging to provide a successful student experience. And a lot of students found themselves becoming less engaged, less able to persist with the course content and be successful. So all three of these things, I think, are really important lessons for us as we go forward, because having given so many students a taste of the flexibility and access of learning online, the vast majority of them want to continue having at least some of that flexibility going forward. But now that we recognize that in order to create a successful experience for the students, we need to do it in a different way. We need to continue developing the pedagogy and tools in order to make the student experience in the online format one that students are actually going to be successful in.
And can we delve into that a little bit deeper? So you talked about the flexibility. What are students now going to be expecting from the student experience in the years to come? Because some of them have been involved. I mean, your numbers are phenomenal in terms of what you achieved at Coursera. I'm a Coursera user, so I'm a big fan. But many of them weren't used to this, as you said, and this access has now become available. What are their expectations going to be in terms of the future of now wanting that flexibility? But what else really do we need to be thinking about providing them in terms of EdTech?
Well, I think what we are also going to start to see is a blurring of the lines between what is viewed as the traditional college experience of the full-time person going to school for 3 or 4 years, and that is basically their full-time occupation. That's one population. The other population is the the adult learner who is actually in the workplace and they're just taking courses online as a way of enhancing their career opportunities and so on. And And we're seeing a blurring of those two populations because we saw more and more people in that sort of out in the wild adult learner benefiting from college classes. And then at the same time, we now have people who are more traditional college goers, but realize that maybe they're benefiting from having more of a hybrid experience where they work part of the time, they travel part of the time, and they study part of the time. Now, the interesting thing is that that blurring of those two populations is something that is now something we recognize, but existed even before. So using US statistics, over half of the college students in the US, undergraduates, not even graduate students, are actually non-traditional learners. That means that they are working part or full time, they are taking care of a dependent, whether it's a child or a parent, and they're not able to be that sort of utopian ideal of the full-time student walking around on green lawns and engaged in small seminar discussions with a small group of other people. So that blurring was something that we kind of ignored in a lot of the previous before the pandemic, but now that we're seeing that merging from those two sides, I think we're going to have to think about that entire continuum from full-time students to these part-time students, all the way through to the working adults who just want to continue their education.
And sometimes with whichever category they fall into, we know that some people get frustrated, right? They do, and then they drop off. So how do you re-engage students who've spent particularly the last year feeling frustrated? They felt that whatever they were experiencing was poorly delivered. Maybe they were just in the wrong category. They should have been in the more flexible category rather than the kind of college category, as you say. How do we re-engage them? What do we need to do? Is it something that tech needs to do? Is it something that government needs to do? Where's the responsibility and what can we do about it?
So I actually don't think that the lack of engagement has to do with lack of flexibility. I think that in some ways the online format often gives students too much flexibility and doesn't create enough of a sense of commitment to the learning process, to your fellow classmates, because you kind of feel like you're there on your own with your video camera and you're not beholden to anyone to be successful in your class. So one of the things that we found at Coursera is some early experiments that increased the amount of flexibility the students had actually caused a decrease, often a substantial decrease in completion rates. So maybe the most striking example of that was when we, by student demand, removed all deadlines of assignments from the courses, and basically completion rates dropped to almost zero because there was always, I'm not going to get around to doing the assignment today, so I'm going to do it tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes. So I think what's one of the really important lessons that we learned at Coursera, and I think relearned in the context of the pandemic, is that it's important to create a social structure where students engage with the instructor and engage with each other so that there's a sense of momentum, commitment, and shared learning. Learning is not really, for most people, a solo experience. There are a small number of people who are sufficiently self-motivated and sort of engaged in their own learning process that they're able to be successful on their own. The rest of us need a friend, a teacher, someone to keep us moving along.
It's really interesting because when you're talking about it, I can completely see it, sort of the perspective of the student engaging, and it's really about them taking agency in their own learning and then them choosing, do I need a peer, do I need a teacher? What's quite interesting, and it's much more prevalent in the sector that I'm focused on, which is K-12, where you have, it's regulated and everyone goes, but it's that whole fear of, is the technology going to take over and replace all teachers? What do you say to that? In higher education, do you come across that when you founded Coursera, when you were dealing with higher education institutions? Were there professors out there who said, hang on a second, what about the traditional classroom? Were there any skeptics? How did you overcome that? Because I know that that's something that's really, really interesting to the EdTech community.
So I think that certainly in the early days of Coursera, there were a lot of dire predictions or optimistic predictions, I guess, depending on which perspective you take, that somehow Coursera and the massive open online courses, the MOOCs, will put universities out of business. Those predictions have not come true. We were never supportive of those predictions, nor did we believe them to be the case. But I think that there is one needs to distinguish in the learning experience between content and teaching, and content, I think, is something that is really an important component of this. One of the things that universities provide is a fresh set of content that is constantly updated as new research and new science happens. And I think that's a really important component in creating a body of knowledge that can be disseminated to a large number of students. And there is that appeal, that incredible appeal of being able to take, Nobel Prize winners and have their insights be shared with the world at large. But the content is only half of the learning experience. And the equally important, I think, is having someone there who is helping you make sure that you really understand and are engaged in your learning content. And what we found is that without that interactivity, without that sort of real meaningful engagement with the content, it's kind of like, goes, I don't want to say comes in one ear and goes out the other, but it's certainly not the same level of actionable, usable knowledge as it is when someone forces you to actually say problem solve and have a discussion about the material.
And so, Daphne, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a tough question here, and I think that I know you're going to give me an honest response. So, before we start looking forward, I do want to go back a little bit and think about, last year, parts of this year. So when we look at the pandemic, what grade would you give the sector's response? So when you think about higher education outside of traditional, the traditional sector, not just online learning, what grade would you give them? You can give me an A to an F.
I would say B minus. I think
that's pretty specific. It's got a minus in that.
Well, I mean, people really did their best in very trying circumstances. It's really not easy. I mean, we learned in Coursera how difficult it is to teach online and how challenging it is for people to make that transition. And then all of a sudden they had to make that transition on a dime. They turned on a dime and it's like, okay, now I have to teach online and I've never done that before. So I think given the circumstances, a B minus is actually pretty good. But I can tell you that it took a while before we got to the B minus stage. So for us, the inception of Engageli, which you referred to earlier, had to do with our two high school age daughters who also transitioned to Zoom school at the beginning of the pandemic. And, they're both good kids, they're academic high performers. So you would think that they would do fine. And yet we found as we walked past their bedroom one day that one of them had gotten into the habit of turning off her camera and her microphone 5 minutes into class and spent the rest of the time perfecting her Sims game. And the other one was basically working her way through the Netflix catalog. Neither of those were particularly enhancing of their learning. And so when you think about that, it's really challenging to think about what happens to the people who are not as well prepared, those who come from backgrounds that have not given them the kinds of motivation, study skills, family support, small class sizes like they had, and how difficult it is for them to stay engaged and successful in completing courses. And I think to us, that was one of the real sort of awakenings that caused us to set up Engageli, because we realized that you really needed to create, and it's now in fact possible to create, a learning platform that is truly engaging. And maybe the important lesson learned is that if you start thinking about it in this way, you can actually build a virtual learning platform that is more engaging than your traditional classroom. And I think that's another thing that will never return after the pandemic. I think we now understand that online can in fact be better if done right.
And a member of the audience, I've got a comment here by a lecturer, is that they double speed through online material and miss out on the foundation. And that's what you were saying, confirm that. But how can we solve that problem?
I think it comes back down to content is only the beginning of the learning experience rather than the full learning experience. So certainly you can speed through the video material, but if you are forced to engage, forced to interact, answer questions, work on problems with your fellow classmates, your lack of foundations will manifest very quickly. And so you'll have to go back and watch whatever it was that you sped through in the beginning. And so I think it's really creating a teaching platform, a learning platform that is more than just about content delivery via video.
And, you know, just from my own experience, because my kids and I were on Coursera last year particularly, but there is a community element of it. I mean, in the sense that, you know, one creates work, you have the rest of your cohort, they mark your work. And I suppose was the purpose of that twofold, to create the community, but also to help with the marking of work because of the scale of marking? I mean, how did that community element come by at Coursera? When did you build that? And what have you seen from that? Because it feels like it's that community side of things that could be part of the answer. And Daphne, I just want you to extend this a little bit into something that's been in my mind since you've been talking about certain types of students. And that's also, in terms of community, we've got some really big countries where we want to provide education. They don't necessarily have access to top tier education. And so how can this all extend into going into those sorts of markets? I know you're already in those markets, but extend beyond those kind of early adopters. So actually this could be accessible by all, hopefully, if the infrastructure exists. It's a long question with lots of elements, but I'd love you to tackle it because I think it's a really, really important issue.
So I think there's actually two questions in that, both of which are important. So I'm going to answer them separately. So first, on the question of how we came about the community, the very first MOOCs that came out of Stanford were actually semi-synchronous, in the sense that a lecture came out every week, or a set of lectures came out every week, and then students were eagerly awaiting for that lecture to come out. And so it synchronized the community to a week-by-week cadence where everyone was on the same schedule. And so when one person was confused and they posted a message with a question on the discussion forums, there were always people there who were at the same stage of the course and were able to explain to the person who was confused what was going on. And in some of the early incarnations of the MOOCs, when the audiences were really large, simply because of the breadth of time zones on the course, we had something like an average response rate of a few minutes, maybe 15 to 20 minutes between the time that the question was posted and the time that someone responded to it. And that was an incredible experience for both the person asking the question and the person answering the question, because they both felt like there was someone there, and it created also a sense of community and kind of not wishing to disappoint your classmates by dropping off, and also just in terms of the material itself, being able to get help when you needed it so that you didn't fall behind and by not understanding some of the content. So that really drove a lot of the design elements that came into Coursera in having people engaging with each other in terms of question answering, in terms of taking and sharing notes from the class, and in terms of the peer grading, which I agree with you is also partly a scalability solution in terms of making sure that open-ended questions actually do get graded, so we're not just doing multiple choice, but also I think is really important in terms of the learning experience itself, in having students being forced to evaluate the work of other students. So in that respect, one of the things that I think is a really important lesson learned is also that this ties into some of the most, in my mind, important and influential pedagogical observations that have come out of the work of Jim Gibbons at Stanford, the work of Eric Mazur at Harvard, which is that peer teaching is a really important part of the learning experience. So, for example, and this will all come back to your final question, Priya, so it'll all tie together. So that's really nice. The work of Jim Gibbons dates back to some of the early experiments at Stanford on offering televised instruction to remote students in the San Francisco Bay Area who are unable to come to Stanford to engage in physical classes. And this was really in the early days. So this was video cassettes, literally physical video cassettes that were shipped to sites around the Bay Area by mail. And students in the beginning were asked to watch those video cassettes individually, and they would basically do the classes by correspondence. What Jim Gibbons tried to do was to create a sense of community around each of those courses. So at each of those sites, he created a small group of people who would watch the video together, and there was a facilitator who would pause the video every 7 minutes or so and force a group discussion by asking people a question and forcing them to discuss the material that they just learned. And that sense of community and the sort of imperative to actually engage actively in the course material gave rise to a situation which was documented using ample data, that the students who did this type of interaction not only performed considerably better than the ones who were watching the video cassettes on their own, they actually performed better than the on-campus Stanford students. And so despite the fact that many of them had worse sort of SAT scores, worse entry qualifications. So that comes back to engagement being a really important component of the learning experience, which is also something that Eric Mazur's experiments on peer instruction show. So coming back to your final question in that series, when you asked about the many countries with lack of access, and how do we create a valuable learning experience in countries that don't have a strong educational system with enough capacity to offer an educational experience to all the people. You could imagine creating something that looks like what Jim Gibbons did at Stanford, where you have the small number of instructors that are available, some of them in country, maybe some with material that's imported from elsewhere, being delivered via video platform with small local groups of students, engaging in the material by discussing with each other and answering questions and really forcing each other to sort of actively engage with the material. And that combination of sort of high quality content on the one side with a lot of local engagement on the other is, I think, one of the most powerful solutions to the capacity problem of education in countries where the infrastructure is not as strong.
And, with all of this potential growth, with the potential that it can really solve problems, I do have to ask you, what do you say to the deniers? There are deniers out there who just say, well, it's just much better to go to an Ivy League or a Russell Group, and this is never really going to last. There are the deniers. We can't say they aren't. And there might be that the people who are watching this, none of them are deniers, because it's a bit of a self-selecting group who are interested in technology who might be watching this. But this is on YouTube. It's available for all to see. What do you say to those people who aren't getting on this train? Is it that it's just left without them? I mean,
Well, Priya, I think if you are one of the fortunate few who can go and attend that small 12-person seminar class at Stanford or Oxford and engage with that sort of in a face-to-face, beautiful surroundings with other students and the instructor, I think more power to you, and you're very, very fortunate. The vast majority of humanity, even in developed countries, even in the United States where we have Princeton, and in the UK where we have Oxford, and certainly much more so in the countries that you were referring to earlier, Priya, where the educational infrastructure is not nearly as strong, they don't have that opportunity. Some of them don't have access to college at all because there just not enough of those to go around, or because their life circumstances don't allow them to engage with that type of experience. And in others, that opportunity, the colleges exist, but when you go, you realize that you're one of 500 people in an auditorium looking down at a tiny little instructor writing stuff on the board. And what kind of an engaging experience is that? It's not that sort of utopian 12-person in a seminar room. So I think for those deniers who are telling us that this amazing alternative exists, it does, but it's only for the privileged 1%, if that. And for those deniers who are saying, well, only face-to-face works, and we need to make sure everyone comes to campus to do their face-to-face teaching, I would ask them to look, a single mother in the eye trying to finish college while she supports her kids and works 2 jobs, and tell her that the only way we're going to allow her to complete her education is by forcing her to come to campus. And maybe I'll, just to tell one story on this point, and it's one of my favorite Coursera stories, although I could tell many, many others. It's the story of Sharmeen Shahabuddin from Bangladesh. So Sharmeen was one of our early Coursera learners. And in Bangladesh, as some of you know, girls are often sold into servitude to a husband or an employer. And Sharmeen didn't want that fate for herself or for her friends, so she convinced a friend to run away with her, and they opened a bakery. Unfortunately, neither of them had a clue on how to run a business, and so the bakery was about to go under when Sharmeen discovered the ability to take online courses from Coursera. And she took a bunch of business courses from Wharton, from Michigan, from other universities, and learned how to run a business and increase the revenues of the bakery from $700 to $5,000. And by doing so, was able to support not only her and her friend, but a total of 7 women who otherwise would have been sold into servitude. So I think that's not something that you could just tell Sharmeen, oh, you could go to, the Russell Group. I think creating that type of opportunity, which really only an education can unlock, is a moral imperative for us as a society.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I've got a couple of those stories from Century, and I know that when I spoke to the young child who said, well, I'm no longer stuck, I no longer think I'm bad at mathematics, and I now know that I can get help even though I'm too shy to put my hands up in the classroom. I thought, well, that was definitely worth the 16 million it cost to build this system. Just that one story, let alone the many others. And I know that you'll have millions and millions of people who are ever so grateful for co-founding Coursera and making it such a success, because this is the EdTech platform, and there's the education side, but there's also the technology side, which is actually the sheer challenge and difficulty of building a technology company and getting that sort of scale. And maybe actually I'll ask you about that. Before I do, I just want to encourage the audience to feel free to ask questions, because I am receiving them. I've got one on the side there that I will ask Daphne in a moment, but this is your moment to ask questions from the co-founder of Coursera. This opportunity does not come across every single day, so please feel free to ask questions. But Daphne, let's talk about that for a moment. You co-founded Coursera. Can you tell us a little bit of the story of the co-founding of it, how it was created, then how did you scale it? Because there are so many edtech startups, right? But you see the few that scale, right? And then the few that become those unicorn billion-dollar companies. In a few minutes, tell us how to build a billion-dollar company. We'd love to know the answer to that.
Well, I wish I had a recipe. I don't know that I predicted when we built Coursera that it would be a billion-dollar company. We saw it more as a moral imperative, work that several of us, myself, my co-founder Andrew Ng, and others had been doing at Stanford, had given rise to what was an experiment of let's launch some of those Stanford courses that we'd been delivering on technology platforms to our internal students. Let's make those available to a broader group of students worldwide. And it just went viral. I mean, from the moment those courses went out, it was just, there was no marketing whatsoever. There was one New York Times article that just sort of started to spread. And we had countries like coming online one at a time, you could see them lighting up, and then via social media people would tell their friends that, oh, you can take a Stanford course online for free. Isn't that amazing? And so I think that was what we did was just amazingly found at the very start of our journey a remarkable product market fit. That is, there is such a hunger for high quality education in so many parts of the world, and we provided them access to something that they would otherwise never have. And so that really was the beginning of the, if you will, the demand side of the curve. And the other part, which was the supply side, was, I think, a little bit of fear, honestly. The supply side being the university side, where there was a clear realization, I think, that this digital revolution was coming to higher ed. And we either were going to sit there on the platform, we being a university, watching the train zip by, or we were going to be on the train trying to guide its trajectory. And we were able to get a lot of universities to jump on board by a combination of FOMO, fear of missing out, and the interest of getting their content, their brand, their reputation out to a much, much larger number of learners. And when you have that incredible alignment between supply and demand, that product market fit, it was, I mean, that's really what creates this type of unicorn type success. Now, of course, just to be, to admit to the challenging part, I mean, there was clearly a challenging part of just, building the company in a way that kept up with the incredible growth and scale. So that was one big challenge. And the other challenge was how to make this be a sustainable, self-sustaining operation. Because, of course, when we started out, the courses were all free. And the challenge of that, of course, is that doesn't give you a revenue stream. So how do you create something that maintains that free aspect, which we found to be so powerful, while still giving us enough of a revenue that we can continue to build the company? And we played around with a number of different things. And as you all may know, Coursera now has 3 separate business lines that are actually beautifully synergistic with each other. One is the direct-to-consumer education for the many students who are, as we said, outside of traditional higher ed, but want to continue learning. We have the degrees program, in which we work with universities to provide much larger scale online degrees, and then that actually works really well with the direct to consumer, because many of the students who come in through the open classes are actually, well, oh, that's really interesting, I can get a degree online, and they kind of provides us with a user funnel towards the degree program. And the third one is working with employers to offer an education to their in-house employees. And again, that's really nice because it provides a funnel from the direct-to-consumer students who are now all of a sudden eligible for jobs that they would never otherwise had. And so that strategy really emerged over time, and figuring it out was a non-trivial endeavor in terms of how do you align all those different pieces.
I imagine. So that's really, really helpful, though. Some really interesting nuggets there for those that are building companies. And the fact is, it is a journey, isn't it? You have to go through it. And as you say, there are challenges. It can be pretty adventurous. Just following on from that, before I come to a couple of the audience questions, so I know we've only got a few minutes left, but I did want to ask you, which higher education institutions do you think are leading the way now? Given that we've had a year of disruption, some obviously formed the digital strategy very, very quickly in the last year, but are there any particular notable institutions that people should be looking out for?
I don't know that I hate to sort of point the finger at some, because I haven't kept track of all of the different developments that have happened. And I know many universities have really stepped up their game. And so I would congratulate everyone who managed to survive this year of the pandemic, because it wasn't easy for anyone to do that. So really hats off to every college instructor and every teacher in general. It was a very hard year for everyone.
And so a couple of questions. Let me just go through the ones of the audience before I finish with a final question. So one is, will pen and paper disappear from UK, US classrooms in the next 5 to 10 years? I'm sure this is coming from a denier who's worried about it. So.
I don't know. I think that there's certainly some room for people to still write their thoughts on pen and paper and take notes and stuff. But what I think we found, certainly in our experience on Engageli, is that digital platforms and the fact that there's this communication between the instructor and the student in an electronic medium really helps create an incredible data stream that instructor can use to figure out which students are actually paying attention and which ones are not, in ways that you can't if all they're doing is communicating with their own piece of paper. And that allows us to do this personalized interventions, which I know also is something that you do a lot in K-12. And really
golden in K-12 to figure out if someone's skipping through.
Yeah. I think that. So I view the move to an electronic medium as an incredible opportunity to create a much greater data stream for the instructor so that they can personalize their response to the students and make sure that every student's learning.
And there's a fantastic question in the audience, Daphne. So let's move to this one. You mentioned that digital upskilling platforms and MOOCs won't take over universities. What do you think will then be the university's USP? Would they work more with these types of platforms, and how? From the audience.
So I think that, first of all, because of the significant interest among students to retain some of their educational experience in the online format, and for some students it might be all of it just because of their lifestyle, I think universities are going to have to adopt some of these online platforms and work with them to create that access for their own students. And to me, that would be the sort of the starting point for creating an educational experience that is aimed at a much broader population. So all of those people who are now no longer college students, but still want to engage in learning, they've not had that much interaction with educational institutions other than via this sort of one-directional communication of MOOCs. And universities who are at the forefront can say, well, if I can teach my own students, the matriculated students, in an online format, maybe I can now reach out to a much, much larger audience and allow and enable this lifelong learning experience that so many people want, but have been very challenging to provide as long as face-to-face teaching was the default.
So I'm going to shoot through these because we've got audience questions coming in now, and I know we've only got a few minutes. So what do you think of Education 5.0? So human experience has not reached a vast majority of universities. They usually speak only about student experience, student learning, CX, but nobody focuses on designing the EX. What do you think?
I'm not sure what EX is, but so I'm not sure I fully understand the question, and I apologize for that. But I think that as we, again, work towards engaging with a much broader, larger audience, and also have the data streams that I alluded to earlier that allow us to keep track of which students are learning and paying attention and engaging with the course content, we will by force need to create a much broader human experience type of interaction with people that are not our traditional college goers. And I think that will be a hugely transformative thing for society, because I think from a societal perspective, we've moved away from a world where the kind of education that you got as whatever, an undergraduate in the first 4 years of your adult life is going to be sufficient for you in your 40s and 50s, when the content of your job didn't even exist at the time that you went to college. And so I think we as a society have to move towards a lifelong learning model. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for us to do that.
That's a fantastic answer. I'm going to end with one question. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions. There were a couple in there. So next time, I suppose, and before I get to my final question, I think you've got a bit of a fan, and they've asked if they can get in touch with you as a speaker. Daphne, what's the answer to that? Is it connecting on LinkedIn or something like that?
LinkedIn is great.
If you can connect with Daphne on LinkedIn, that would be great. Or by all means, I think if you write to one of her companies, they'll pass it on. That'll be a good idea. So the last question, I think, just to wrap it up, is, Daphne, 2050. I mean, I don't really like being I don't like being a futurist, but 2050. I mean, I can barely think about 2022, let alone 2030. But what's the model of HE? So if you were sitting on the board of a Russell Group University in the UK and Ivy League in the US, I mean, forget the date, but what's the model? What would you be saying to the board of these universities about what they need to be doing in order to engage, in order to actually take advantage of some of these opportunities in the countries that you and I have discussed, right? Because we've seen in my world, we've now got online schools, and some of the biggest brands have got an online school, and those online schools are incredibly popular in the Middle East, in the Far East, China, for example. And it'd be really interesting to hear what you've got to say about that. But what's the model? What would you advise them? What's important?
So I think, and I want to make sure that I emphasize that it's not just about the Ivy Leagues and not just about the Russell Group, because those serve a tiny fraction of the students who really need an education. And the vast majority of education in even in the US and the UK, and certainly in other countries, is offered by universities that cater to a much larger and less selective audience of people who need a much, possibly very different education than the Princetons and the Oxfords of the world. And so, but what I would tell all of these universities is that we need to weave learning into the fabric of our lives, both for the students who are our traditional constituents, who are going to want, in many cases, to consume their education while they're also potentially working in a job or an internship that allows them to apply those skills in a much more hands-on fashion. And so we need to make sure that we fit the learning into a broader set of constraints. And that is even more predominantly the case as we think about education as something that permeates our lives all the way from, early childhood through retirement and beyond. We need to create educational experiences that people who have lives that are not just around their education can benefit from. So I would encourage all those boards of governors, boards of directors to think about how it is that a university can become a hub of learning that is not just serving what it views as its traditional stakeholders, but a much, much larger group, and doing it in a way that allows that education to be consumed in a way that is much more appropriate to the constraints of the 21st century.
Thank you, Daphne. We've talked about the student experience. We've talked about the pandemic and lessons learned. We've graded higher education is what's happened today. We've talked about the deniers. We've talked about the future model. You've given free consultancy advice worth millions of dollars to all of the universities and higher education institutions out there. You've also told the audience today how to build $1 billion company, and there's a lot of luck in there and a lot of other things, but still you did really give them the formula that you know. So we have covered an enormous amount in 40 minutes, and I am ever so grateful. I know everybody who's been listening and everyone who will listen to this is really, really grateful. But Daphne, thank you so much for being an absolute CogX superstar, and all the very, very best.